So the first check I'm going to enter into the toolbox is for my ozone data. And I collect my QC check data on an electronic form. You might collect yours on a handwritten form, and that's fine. This is my bi-weekly QC check form, and I go out and check my sampler every 2 weeks, and then I log the results of these checks into this form. If I scroll through this form, you can see that each page is a different QC check that was done at a different time. So the first check I did at 8:02 a.m. on August 8th, and then I did another check at 8:50 a.m. on the same day, and then I did a third bi-weekly check at 8:22 at 8:09. So these checks span my import. So I'm going to import data that runs from 8:08 to 8:22. So I did one check before I downloaded my data, and then another check at the end of my import. So when you go to download your sample data, you always want to do a QC check at the same time so that you will have those QC checks at the start of your range and at the end of your range. So I'm going to type these values that I collected out in the field into my Toolbox QC data entry form. And I want you to note that there might be some of these fields that are not on the QC form in the Toolbox, and in that case you would just not enter them. For example, control frequency and sample flow are not in the Toolbox form, so you would just skip over those and not enter those. And there also might be some fields on that Toolbox form that you don't collect data for, and that's fine. You just want to keep your checks within the EPA requirements. So check your EPA validation templates for your sampler to make sure that you're doing all the required checks. These boxes that are highlighted in yellow with a black border around them, those are the answers the Toolbox is going to give me when I enter the check data into the Toolbox. So those are what I would copy from the Toolbox into this form, and I'm going to demonstrate doing that. So there's also a linear regression chart, and the Toolbox has the capability of making that chart, and then I could enter these values into my QC sheet. Then I would save this sheet in my folder on my computer and have a record of whether or not this check passed, and I would keep these forever in my backup file on my external drive. I also wanted to note that all of the checks in this document are fake. We made this up just to demonstrate. So we're going to go back into the Toolbox, and we're going to begin entering our data for that first check on 8/8. The first field that we're in is the pollutant field, and it has a drop-down arrow. So I want to click on the drop-down arrow and select the pollutant of ozone from the drop-down list. And I just click on it to select it. And as with the other data entry forms that we've seen, the best way to navigate through these forms is to use the tab key. And it's especially important with this form because some of these fields are going to be automatically filled in by the Toolbox, and the tab key will skip over those fields that it knows the Toolbox is going to fill in. And those fields are the ones that have a qualifier in the title name or a difference in somewhere in the title of the field. So I click the tab key, and I'm taken to the QC frequency field. And again, there's a drop-down arrow, so I'll click on that. And I do bi-weekly checks on my ozone sampler, so I'll select bi-weekly. And when I do this, notice that the Toolbox starts filling in some of these fields. So most people that do bi-weekly checks on ozone do a check one type of a concentration, so the Toolbox fills that in. Well, we'll go over that in more details coming up. So I'm going to continue tabbing through these fields and entering data. I'm going to select myself since I'm the one entering these data. And then the QC date was on 8/8/2013. And the QC time was at 8:02. And the site name has a drop-down box. We only have one site for ozone, so that's why there is only one site listed here. So I'm going to select that site. And the sampler, we only have one sampler for ozone. So we select INO3. And then I come to the type of assessment field. This is a conditionally required field, which means that if you want to submit your QA check to AQS, you need to select a value in this field. I do want to submit that data, so I'm going to select a value. So I click on the drop-down arrow, and there's two options here. There's the 1-point quality control and the annual performance evaluation. The EPA requirements for gaseous pollutants require you to do a 1-point check as your biweekly check. So that means that you check the concentration that's known to the concentration that's measured and enter that into the toolbox. For my biweekly check, I actually do 4 concentration checks of known and measured values. However, I still need to select the 1-point quality control option here because that is what EPA requires. They only require one 1-point quality control check for a biweekly check. And also because annual performance evaluation is for the check that's done by an auditor with independent equipment. So I can't use that option. If I was to hire an auditor, I would select the annual performance evaluation selection, but I am going to go ahead and select 1-point quality control. And just a note that when you select 1-point quality control, only the check 1 type is submitted to AQS. So I have 4 checks. All of those other checks are not going to be submitted to AQS, and only the check type 1 is going to be submitted to AQS. Also, if you make the selection of 1-point quality control, the toolbox only allows you to enter values in a certain range in the known 1 field because those are the EPA requirements. And those requirements for gaseous pollutants are different depending on what pollutant you measure. So if you're measuring carbon monoxide, that range is between 1 and 10 parts per million. And for other gaseous pollutants, that range is between 0.01 ppm and 0.1 ppm. If your known value is not within this range and you still want to enter that data into the toolbox, you'd have to use one of these other checks to enter that data into the toolbox. You couldn't enter it into the check 1 fields. And also it could not be submitted to AQS, obviously because of those requirements. So after I fill in that type of assessment field, I click the tab key and go to the next field, and notice that these are white fields that are optional, and I don't have this information, so I'm just going to click through them. Let's see if I have a site device full scale in my documentation. I see full scale, so I'll go ahead and enter that value, and I don't have these values here. Shelter temperature I know I have. Let's take a look at what that is. Shelter temperature 22 degrees Celsius, and then press the tab key. And notice it skipped over the shelter temp qualifier field and went straight to the shelter pressure field. And that is because the toolbox populates qualifier fields. Since the toolbox did not write a value into the shelter temperature qualifier field, it's completely blank. That means that the check passed, so the shelter temperature is within the limits recommended by EPA. And if you need to know those limits, you can look those up in the EPA validation templates. We also have a list of those requirements at the end of the notes document. I don't record my shelter pressure, so I'm going to go ahead and click the tab key. I'm now in the zero check units field, and I do have a zero check that I do on my sampler, so I need to populate this field because it is blue and I have that check. So I need to enter my units for my zero check. Let's see what those are in my sheet. So those are in units of parts per million, or ppb. So I will select that, and then zero input known, that's a 0 value because that's the known value for my zero check is obviously 0. So I don't enter anything in that field, and I tab over to my zero device display. Let's take a look at what that is. So that is a value of 28. So I type that in and press tab. And notice now what happened. So as soon as I tabbed out of that field, in the zero qualifier field, I got a flag. So whenever you see that happen It means that your check is failing according to the EPA QC limits. So this means that my zero check is out of range. And the reason I did a second QC check on the same day is because of this. When I was out in the field, I noticed that this zero device display value is very large. And so I did some maintenance on my sampler and fixed it and did another QC check after that. So now I can go back into my data collection sheet and fill in those yellow fields. So past zero check. No, I didn't. So I'm going to go ahead and fill this in as no L1C flag. So that tells me that that did not pass. My temperature did pass. It was within range. The toolbox did not assign any flags. So I'm going to say yes. And I'll go back to the toolbox, tab into the next field. And this part of the form is a little bit confusing to me because I've got these different known one, device display one, data logger output one, all these different fields that are a little bit confusing for me. So I am going to go into the help file, and remember that these help files are very detailed and they're always here for you. So if you ever have a question on what's going on, just click on the help file and see if it's in there. And if it's not, feel free to email your instructors. So I'll go ahead and click here for help file and see what happens. So that brings up my help file, and I'm going to scroll down a bit until I find something about these fields. Here it tells me about the different fields, and it explains that the device display field is actually what's displayed on the analyzer, and the data logger output field is what's displayed on my data logger. So if I only have an analyzer or a sampler, and I don't use a data logger, I would only enter a value into that device display field. If I was using only a data logger and not looking at my sampler, I could just enter a value into the data logger output field. And it's also fine if you use both to enter values into both of these fields. So I'm going to go back into my data collection sheet and see what values I have. So I've got an analyzer value and a DAS value. The DAS value is the data logger value, so I have both of them that I need to enter into the toolbox. So I'll go back into the toolbox, and in the concentration field, that's already filled in by the toolbox for the check type of concentration. So I tab over to the check one units and enter my units, and those are in ppb. And then I tab over to known one, and let's see what the known one value is. The known value is 55, and my device display, or my analyzer value, is 54, and my data logger output value is also 54. And now you'll see that the toolbox filled in these fields. So it filled in difference from known. It did a calculation, and it also filled in the percent difference from known by doing a calculation. It did not fill in a value in the qualifier field. And as I've said before, if there's not a value in the qualifier field, that means that the check is passing. So I press the tab key, and that takes me to the next check type, and the toolbox did not automatically populate the check type beyond check one type because most people only do a 1 point check. I happen to do a 4 point check, which is above and beyond the EPA recommendations for my sampler. So I need to enter the check 2 type of concentration, and ppb is my units. And I check my sheet here, and I've got a known of 90, so I'll enter that. And then let's see what my device display was, 90.1. And if it's easier for you, you can also copy and paste from your electronic data collection sheet. And my DOS value is 90.2. And again, nothing filled in the qualifier field, so that check passed. I'll go ahead and click tab again. And here, I accidentally pressed tab too quickly. And so I tabbed out of check 3 type and went directly into check 3 units. And I get this error message from the toolbox saying, oh, you have to enter your check 3 type before you enter your units. So I just click OK. And then as you can see, the cursor goes back to the check 3 type field. And I'll go ahead and select concentration and tab into the units and select ppb and known 3 is 120, and then let's see, my analyzer and my DOS is 120.3. Now my check 4 type is concentration again. Let's see what those values are. 180 and 180.8. And I am done entering my concentration checks. And as you can see, none of the qualifiers are populated, and that means that all of my checks passed. And what I would now do is do a quick check to make sure that I entered this correctly. So I check the values I'd entered against those on my data collection sheet and make sure I did not make any data entry errors. And I'd also like to put a little note here that I did do some maintenance on my sampler after the failing QC check. So I'll write that down. And that looks good. So that's completed the data entry I need to do for this first check.